Alright, so we're going to pick up now with our next section, which is going to take a look first off at roots and root hairs, which are, for all intents and purposes, the functional, business end of the root. This is where most of the absorption takes place, if not all the absorption. Most of the absorption takes place at the root hairs. And the reason why this is the case is that these root hairs are incredibly numerous in abundance. They're very fine, very thin, lots and lots of surface area, and as we've seen, the more surface area you have, the more absorption in this case you're going to be able to do. So root hairs really help take up water. They help take up nutrients, especially things like phosphorus and a bit of nitrogen as well. These, however, are not the same thing as being lateral roots. Lateral roots are actually branches off of a single root. Lateral roots are actually made up of multiple cells. A root hair is the production of a single cell. So these are not roots that are going to branch off and grow several feet off into the soil in every direction. These are, in this picture, as big as they're going to get. What this picture is actually a bean sprout. We can see the older, mature part of the root up here. We can see some root hairs, and then eventually down here at the base, you see the root cap. Last time I mentioned briefly some different types of cells associated with plants. We said there are three main cell types. Parenchyma cells, which are alive at maturity and also relatively thin in terms of their cell wall, are the most abundant, and so they're going to be involved with storage of materials like starch, especially photosynthesis. When we take a look at the mesophyll or the middle section of the leaf, those cells are primarily parenchyma cells, as well as secretion. So when we see cells that are producing toxins or waxes or those kinds of things, those typically would also be parenchyma cells. Collenchyma cells are also alive at maturity. These are the second thinnest of the different cell types when it comes to thickness of cell wall. Their cell walls are quite a bit thicker actually than parenchyma cells, but they're still flexible. So kind of the easiest or maybe most easiest to imagine example of collenchyma cells would be like the strings in a piece of celery. Those cells are supportive, but they're still flexible. It's basically like a string inside that celery stalk that gives it flexible support so it can bend without breaking. The third type of cell is the sclerenchyma cell, and these are dead at maturity. Their primary function is going to be for support, for protection, for structural strength, and primarily in most cases that's going to be their function. These cells, like I said, are dead at maturity. They also have extremely thick cell walls, which makes them very expensive to produce. Sclerenchyma cells typically aren't produced in anywhere near as much abundance as, say, parenchyma cells especially. But where they do occur, they do a really good job of providing structure and strength and support to the body of the plant. So again, we take a look at the different cell types. Parenchyma cells, relatively thin cell wall. These cells down here actually are parenchyma cells. Thin cell walls, living in maturity. Very much less specialized. They tend to be kind of what you would refer to maybe as the foot soldier of the plant. There are more of them than any other type of cell, and they really do most of the normal day-to-day functioning of that plant. Collenchyma cells, which would be what these are up here, see these have thicker cell walls than these parenchyma cells do, are again supportive, and they offer that flexibility. These cells are both alive at maturity. One of them is more expensive to produce than the other one. That would be the collenchyma cells. But both of these are alive at maturity. The sclerenchyma cells, very, very tough, very, very thick. These are no longer alive at maturity, so these cells grow, they mature for a while, they live, they die off, and then they become able to sort of take on their primary function inside of that plant. They have very, very tough, thick cell walls with a substance called lignin. Lignin is a very important biopolymer, chemical made by a living thing that's second probably only to cellulose when you look at the abundance that we find this stuff in. It's also really hard to break down. There are very, very few things in nature that can actually digest lignin. There are some fungi that can do it, but that's really about it. Bacteria, for the most part, can't break it down. Animals cannot digest it. Most fungi can't digest it either, so it's really, really tough. Very good at maintaining a long-term structural integrity for a plant. The two different kinds of sclerenchyma that we talked about, both of them are structural. The first one are fibers, and so when you think about fibers in the stem of a tree, they give it strength. They're very, very tough, lots of tensile strength to those fibers inside the stem of that tree. The second type are sclerids, and sclerids are not strands. They're not fibers in terms of shape. They're often more of a spherical or geometrical shape, sort of like that. So you see these things occurring typically in groups, sometimes singly, but usually in groups. And where they occur, they're going to impart a really, really tough covering over something. If you think about a peach pit or a cherry pit, very, very tough, right? Very difficult to break those open. You can't even do it with your teeth. They're so tough. The outer part of that pit is made up of a layer of sclerids that are all fused together to form a very strong, very protective outer covering around that seed. Same thing with a peach pit. When you bite into a pear, right? Pears have that kind of gritty texture, and the little bits of grit that you find inside that pear are actually individual sclerids that are interspersed throughout that tissue. So in that case, they're not as dense, so it's not like biting into a peach pit, but they're certainly detectable when you take a bite of a pear in terms of that gritty texture. Xylem tissue is one of our two types of vascular tissue. We're going to take a look later on toward the end of this lecture at how xylem actually move water from the roots up to the leaves. But it is involved in moving water. And again, this is pronounced xylem. Sometimes people have a hard time figuring out that X, but it sounds like a Z. It's xylem. There are a couple different types of xylem. Vessels are a type of vascular tissue that are only found in flowering plants. So when we talk about angiosperms, angiosperms are plants that produce flowers of some type, and angiosperms are the only group of plants that have vessels. They are the most efficient of water-conducting tubes inside of a plant. So what we have here are cells that are end-to-end, cylindrical, and dead. Xylem cells are dead at maturity, kind of like the sclerenchyma cells are. They're very similar in that regard. They're end-to-end, and they allow water to pass from one cell to the next through what we call a perforation plate. So this is an actual close-up view of one. We see a perforation plate here. Again, sort of a different shape, one over here on this side and this one here, but they're involved in transporting water. Tracheids are a type of water-conducting tissue that we find not only in angiosperms, but also in gymnosperms, which would be things like pine trees, and also in ferns. Ferns also have tracheids. The only group of plants that doesn't have either vessels or tracheals would be like the mosses. Mosses and liverworts and those kinds of things don't have any type of vascular tissue to speak of in terms of what we're looking at here. But all the other groups have at least tracheids, and of course the angiosperms have both tracheids and vessels. So these cells are sort of overlapping at the ends. So we're going to see a side-to-side sort of overlapping, but again, they're also dead at maturity, and they allow for the transport of water. The other thing transported in that water is going to be ions, and also the body of the plant itself is supported by the xylem. So especially when you start getting into plants that have secondary xylem, which basically would mean trees, most of the stem of that plant, most of that tree trunk, if you will, is made up of old, broken down, and dead secondary xylem. So what happens for a period of time here, these xylem are transporting water, but eventually they break down. They stop transporting water because the water column actually breaks. And at that point, the function of the xylem is no longer water transport because that can't happen. The water column is broken. But what it can do is it can offer structural strength and support to the body of the plant itself. The process by which water evaporates from the leaves in a plant is called transpiration. So we see water evaporating at the leaves from stomata, and the evaporation of that water from the leaves allows water to move all the way up through the body of the plant from the roots. Basically what's happening here is that as water evaporates from the leaves, it's going to pull water up the rest of the plant. So when water is moving up a plant or up a tree, it's not being pushed up from the roots, it's being pulled up from the leaves, pulled up from the roots from the leaves, right? So it's going to move up that way. The other thing that we find here amidst these xylem cells are fibers, which again are structural and supportive and for strength, and also a bit of ground tissue as well for general functionality. Well, the second type of vascular tissue that we're going to see is called phloem. And phloem is involved in conducting sucrose, and in some cases starch, from the leaves down toward the roots. So the phloem is going to be moving in the opposite direction from the xylem. Xylem goes from bottom up, phloem goes from top down. So in the phloem we find two main types of cells, both of which are elongated. And I should also mention too here, these cells are alive at maturity. Phloem cells must be alive when they're going to function because they're going to be doing some active transport. And you can't do active transport unless you have proteins to transport things, and unless you have ATP production, you cannot have active transport. So these cells have to be alive. One of the two cell types in the phloem are called sieve cells, and we're going to see these again in ferns, which we refer to seedless vascular plants as things like ferns and horsetails and things like that, and also gymnosperms, which are things like, again, pine trees. We can also see what are called sieve tube members, which are only found, again, in the angiosperms. The angiosperms are by far the more advanced of these different groups in terms of the xylem they have, and in terms of the phloem they have, and later on, as we'll see, in terms of the reproduction they do as well. There are sieve plates that occur at the bases of these cells, which serves almost like a filter or a screen for material moving through these either sieve cells or sieve tube members. Sieve tube members, like I mentioned before, are also more efficient and more specialized, and they come with a helper. Sieve tube members show up with what are called companion cells, which are helper cells that help to keep the sieve tube members alive and functional. They're kind of like the caretakers. The sieve tube members are so specialized, there are some things they can't even do for themselves, so the companion cells are going to help them carry out the day-to-day normal functioning to keep them alive and functional. So here again is a picture of phloem. We have, if this were the top of the plant at the top and the bottom of the plant at the bottom, we have materials flowing down through these phloem, through these sieve plates, and again over here we see a companion cell which is helping to prevent this cell and this cell from dying, because again they can't even do some of their own functioning because they're so specialized. So we'll take a closer look again at roots. Roots are, in addition to the stem, both of those have vascular tissue, for example. Roots are a bit simpler in appearance and function than are the stems. There's not as much going on with the roots as there is with the stems. In any given root, there are about 4 basic locations you can look at. There is a root cap, which occurs in this picture all the way down at the bottom, all the way at the base of this root. Those cells are there to help protect the more sensitive areas behind the root cap. So you got to imagine, moving through the soil, you're subject to a lot of abrasion, a lot of damage, and if you don't have some way of protecting those delicate tissues, you're going to be in rough shape relatively quickly. So the root cap helps to protect those sensitive regions from damage from the soil, for example. We have what's called a zone of cell division. So these cells in this picture right in through here, and also right in through here, in this picture are part of the zone of cell division. Those cells are going through mitosis very quickly and dividing. We have a zone of elongation, so once these cells have been produced through mitosis, they then have the job of growing and getting longer, so that happens up here in the zone of elongation. And then eventually you also have what's called a zone of maturation, which is up at the top of the picture, and the zone of maturation is where you find the root hairs. Right? You don't find them before that, you don't find them after that, you only find root hairs in the zone of maturation. So in terms of functioning for the root, that's where this is going on right here, is with the zone of maturation. So the root cap is a very different kind of a structure than what we see in the stem. We talked before in the first section about how stems, growing into air is a much safer kind of environment than moving through the soil. So the stem doesn't really have anything as an equivalent to what we would call a root cap. The root cap is produced by cells that are being formed by the apical meristem. We can see what are called columella cells, which are back here just sort of north of the root cap, as well as the root cap cells themselves. Columella cells are very important when it comes to perceiving gravity. So if a plant is tipped onto its side and the roots turn and begin to grow back down toward the ground, that would be initiated by columella cells that have sort of detected the presence of the sort of out of position configuration that they're in. And then, of course, root cap cells are protective. And we see in this picture we have a bunch of root cap cells kind of sloughing off the outside of the root and the root cap. Those are ones that are being lost and replaced further back by the apical meristem. The other function of the root cap is to produce a slimy layer of what amounts to lubrication to help this root move more smoothly and more efficiently through the soil without inducing as much damage to the root itself. So that's going to be a factor as well. As for the zone of cell division, again, this is where the apical meristem lives. The cells produced from this are more or less box-shaped. They are cuboidal. They're very, very small vacuoles. They have a lot of potential to grow, but when they're first produced, they're relatively small. And they also have one nucleus per cell. So these are the daughter cells produced by cell division, produced by the apical meristem, that are about to start growing and maturing and eventually becoming functional. Those daughter cells then can divide into one of those 3 primary tissues. So the meristematic cell divides to produce another meristematic cell, and then also one of the 3 primary tissue cell types. So you'd be looking at either ground meristem, procambium, or protoderm as far as the cells produced by the apical meristem, depending on where they are in space. The fate of any cell in terms of what it becomes, protoderm, procambium, or ground meristem, depends a lot on where it is in relation to the rest of the body of the plant. If the apical meristem produces cells toward the outside of itself, those cells typically are going to become part of protoderm. They're eventually going to become part of the dermal system. If cells are produced all the way in the core part of the apical meristem, they're going to become part of the procambium. And if they're produced toward the middle, they're going to be part of the ground meristem. Zone of elongation is kind of what it sounds like. This is where the roots actually get longer. This is where the cells get longer, especially longer than they are wide. The growth and width happens very little in the roots in terms of individual cell growth. Once you get above the zone of elongation, there's no more cell division. Those cells up there that were produced earlier in time are no longer functional, at least in terms of transport or in terms of absorbing water from the ground. So they're there primarily for structural integrity up there above the zone of elongation. Everything above there, including that part, is going to be stationary. So if we look at a given part of a root in relation to the depth within the soil, it doesn't change. And the same thing really is true for the stem as well. You can think about how primary growth works. It only happens at the tips. A part on the stem or a part on a root that's already present is not going to change its position in relation to the rest of the plant. So if you think about, walking up to a tree, and don't do this, but carve your initials in the side of the tree. It's not nice to do that, so don't do that. But if you were to carve your initials in the side of a tree, say at 4 feet off the ground, and you were to come back in 50 years to look for your name on that tree, your name on the tree would still be 4 feet off the ground. It doesn't change because growth only happens at the tips, and that's the case for the roots as well. Your name with a heart around it's not going to go up the tree. It's going to stay exactly where it was when you carved it in the tree 50 years earlier. And then finally, we can look at the zone of maturation, which is where a lot of the actual functionality of the root takes place. This is where we start seeing root hairs. This is where we see a cuticle, which is a waxy layer helped to prevent water loss. And then, like I said, we also see those root hairs. A couple of things we need to point out on this picture. A couple of very important parts toward the inner part of the zone of maturation in a root. Number one is the endodermis. And the cells in this picture, these purple cells, are the endodermis. Those cells come complete with a structure called a Casparian strip. And a Casparian strip is a layer of wax that goes around the cells, kind of separates them from each other, and it's waxy, so what it does is it prevents water from moving around the cells. If any water wants to get into this intersection of cells from the outer section of the root, it's got to go through these cells. It can't go around them because the Casparian strip is in place. It must go through those cells. So it forces things like water to go through the cells as sort of a filter mechanism to make sure there aren't things getting through there that maybe the plant doesn't want in there. We can also see everything inside the epidermis is called the stele. Everything in this picture from the orange cells on toward the center, which is over here somewhere, is called the stele. Part of the stele that's especially important is called the pericycle. So these orange or yellow colored cells here are the pericycle. This is where lateral roots would branch off if a plant is going to produce lateral roots. So they would actually branch off there and move out into the soil in sort of a horizontal or semi-horizontal direction. The reason why lateral roots happen here at these endodermal cells, or at the pericycle, is because the pericycle is directly adjacent to the vascular tissue. And so you can imagine if you have a lateral root branching off in this direction over here, you still want to have some sort of connection to the vascular tissue. If you're bringing in water, you want there to be a close connection to the xylem so that the water can be transported up the stem of the plant. All right, so we can look at different types of plants. The arrangement of the roots is different depending on which type of plant you're looking at. If you're looking at a monocot plant, which a lot of plants are monocots, we'll talk about some differences between them, monocots and dicots, later on. But in this case, monocots have what's known as a ring arrangement in the root. So if you actually take a cross-section through a root and look at it, what you'll see here is, okay, there's a ring of xylem cells, there's a couple of rings of phloem cells, there is something called a pith, which is the inner part of the root, there is an endodermis and Casparian strip, and just inside that there's a layer of cells that function as the pericycle. If we were to look at a dicot, for example, so a dicot would be, most tree species, for example, are dicots, the vascular tissue in the root comes in a cross section. Right? So it's either a cross or a plus sign or an X for the vascular tissue in a dicot root. And again, we see the same things. We see all of these bigger bubbles here are xylem cells. We see phloem cells interspersed among the xylem cells. We see endodermis, just inside of that is pericycle. Endodermis also has Casparian strip, and so that would be the overall inner part of a dicot root. Right? So that's kind of our flow chart as it pertains to organization of the plant body. You start off with a zygote, which turns into an embryo. And that embryo eventually later on will produce a shoot and a root apical meristem that are going to cause the upper and lower parts of the plant to start to grow. Once they start to grow, the different tissues produced can then differentiate into vascular cambium or core cambium. They're going to produce secondary growth of the plant, growth in diameter or girth of the plant. They can form leaf primordia, which produce leaves. They can form bud primordia, which makes shoots. They can make the shoot get longer as well. There's a lot of things that happen here above ground. And the same thing really is true below ground as well. All right, so as far as modified roots, what we're going to do with each section, roots, stems, and leaves, is take a look at the overall generic kind of root or stem or leaf, and then we're going to take a look at some specialized versions of those things. So the first one we're going to see is a taproot system. A taproot system is where you see a root that's got a single dominant primary root that goes straight down into the soil. If you pull up a dandelion, for example, and look at it, that you can do. You can pull up dandelions. That's okay. Pull up a dandelion when you get home, or if you're at home, go pull up a dandelion and take a look at the root. There is one giant dominant root in that plant. That's a taproot. Taproots are really common, again, in dicots. Monocots tend to have more of a fibrous root system. But in dicots, they have a taproot system with that one great big root growing straight down into the soil looking for water. So we can see fibrous roots. Those are more present in monocots. Fibrous roots, there isn't one large, dominant, obvious root. They're all kind of more or less the same size. Those are found, like I said, mostly in monocots. And then there's all different kinds of other modified roots, including what are called adventitious roots. And in this case, adventitious means the roots branch off of something other than another root. So in this case up here, this corn stalk has adventitious roots branching off, not a root, but out of the stem. And in the case of this corn, those adventitious roots happen to be prop roots. They're going to help keep that corn stalk upright and give it some stability so it doesn't tip over in like a heavy storm or something like that. We can look at aerial roots. These plants here are what we call epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. They have what are called aerial roots. Their roots actually are exposed to the air and they absorb things that way. We can see pneumatophores. In this picture here, there's a cypress tree in the background. All these bumps here are known as cypress knees. These are the tips of roots that have grown down into the soil, made a U-turn, and come back up out of the water so that breathing can happen. Pneumatophores, pneumato means air. So these are roots that are able to get air for the roots below ground, which is really key. Contractile roots are things that will actually pull a plant below ground. So these are really common in desert plants where desiccation and heat and intense sunlight are kind of their norm. Contractile roots help pull a plant below ground where it's cooler and darker and perhaps moister. Parasitic roots are what you would find like in a plant called dodder or a plant called, what else? Mistletoe kind of has a similar sort of a thing where the roots actually grow into a host plant tissues and steal carbohydrates from that host plant tissues. We can look at food storage roots, plant roots that are involved in storing carbohydrates like starches. Right? So you see things like carrots, you see things like sweet potatoes. Those are modified food storage roots. Not potatoes, not like Idaho potatoes. Those are something else. Those are not roots. Those are actually modified stems. But in this case, the ones I mentioned before, carrots, radishes, sweet potatoes, those things all are modified roots. Water storage roots are also really common in deserts. This plant here, if you were to dig it up from a desert and cut the roots open, you would actually find water that's fairly abundant and actually drinkable because it's been filtered through the body of the plant. And then finally, buttress roots would be like in this plant over here in the tropics where soil is particularly terrible, very unstable. Plants will often form these very extensive buttress root systems which give you a really broad base down here so the tree has a much easier time standing up and doesn't tip over nearly as easy because of the buttress there at the base of the root. Alright, so we're going to cut off here and I'll start up the next section starting with stems here in just a couple moments.